it is I, Lady Hexera, to give you the good news about witchcraft, and so much more. But first, we must start at the beginning.
Class relations certainly weren't smooth throughout the feudal period. The era is marked with endless peasant revolts and uprisings, because of course serfdom was still a system of exploitation. All the peasants, whether free or not, were tenants of the lord's manor. They paid dearly for the right to live and grow their crops on the lord's land. By the 14th century, peasant revolts against the aristocracy became endemic and frequently armed. According to Sister Federici, quote, "The main objective of the serfs was to keep hold of their surplus value and products and broaden the sphere of their economic and juridical rights. Not only were there endless taxes on peasants, death taxes, inheritance taxes, marriage taxes, taxes because we fucking said so. Peasants were also expected to give a significant amount of their time to their own lord's needs and desires, working the lord's crops, fulfilling the lord's military ambitions and desires, and so on and so forth. Between the taxes and labor, Sister Federici says, quote, revealed all the arbitrariness of feudal power. Thus, they were strenuously resisted." So you see, life on the manor was very harsh. There were times when peasants even starved. They worked their fingers to the bone, but could barely save any surplus for their own. Surplus was an extra amount of goods on top of the labor they owed their lord. The tension started when peasants started getting enough tricks of the trade, and they became fast in production. They started producing more, which they wanted to keep for themselves. And that's what the lords didn't let them do. And that's when the whole world needed a jolt! And it started. Viva la resistance! There were many tactics serfs used before taking up arms. They stopped showing up to work on time. They let the crops spoil, or worked sloppily, taking unnecessarily long breaks, and worst of all, insubordination. And worst of all, what the lords called foot-dragging, false compliance, desertion, pilfering, poaching, were the everyday forms of resistance against the feudal system. And if that failed, there was always armed revolt and murder.
"Thou canst possibly hurt mine poor son. Look at what feudalism hath done to him. He is but a lord, burdened with delicate hands. He hath no learning on how to labor. 'Twas not his fault, this damned, abhorred, and earthy system of feudalism hath made mine son a helpless wretch. 'Tis him that claims the title of victim."
Yeah, I think it's time that you died now.
These are just a small list of revolts throughout the High Middle Ages. There was the Peasant Revolt in maritime Flanders from 1323 to 1328, the Touchons, a movement of bandits in southern France made up of urban artisans and rural peasants that lasted from 1378 to 1384, the English Peasant Revolt of 1381. In 1335, in Ghent, which is here, weavers attempted a workers' democracy that suppressed all authorities except those who performed manual labor. They tried again in 1378, which lasted until 1382. The Ciompi Revolt occurred in Florence in 1382. Cloth workers there forced the bourgeoisie to give the workers shared control of the government. In Catalan, what is modern-day Spain, revolts by the Remenses, a particularly brutal form of serfdom in Catalan, lasted from 1472 to 1486 and ended with King Ferdinand II of Aragon outlawing the more severe abuses of the Remensa system. In Germany, peasant wars began in 1476. Sister Federici says, quote, "This escalated into 4 bloody rebellions led by the Boonschuk, in English the Peasant Union, between 1493 and 1517, and culminating in a full-fledged war that lasted from 1522 to 1525, spreading over 4 countries. Describing this time period, Sister Federici states, quote, "Now is the time," well illustrates the spirit of the European proletariat at the close of the 14th century. An important change occurred during the 12th century. The towns had now started emerging again, and a new class called
merchants had come into being that later evolved into the city class.
These towns were given certain privileges and charters that allowed them an element of autonomy from the manners and therefore the politics of the nobility.
When the towns emerged and trade began, money too started thriving. That was the reason why the surplus was now more important than ever to the peasants, because they wanted to sell it in the towns. These towns had new hopes for serfs and peasants. They dreamed of a flight to the town, where they too could taste the free air. And many did flee to the town. This, of course, created a new crisis in feudalism. Where's all the labor?
The time eventually came when the nobility had no choice but to resolve this conflict. Sister Federici gives a good account of how it happened.
Commutation.
It was when the lords started paying the peasants for their labor services in terms of money, and peasants started paying for their rent to their lords in the same way. According to Sister Federici, it, quote, placed the feudal system on a more contractual basis. That's how the peasants started turning into wage laborers.
A new economy was now emerging with its own ways of exploitation of the working class. It was a tricky and hidden business. It came under the guise of freedom, but it was no blessing. Its effects were very destructive. The money economy started creating class differences way wider than history had ever seen. It snatched whatever land the peasants had and turned them into free workers. Many of the poorest peasants now had no land of their own, no home. Women, like myself, suffered more. It also started being marked by gender conflict. Everywhere there was nothing but division. Women lost whatever rights they had before, the right to property and inheritance. Their income was reduced.
By the 13th century, women were leading the migration from the countryside to the renewed urban centers, and by the 15th century, they made up a large percentage of the population. Most women still lived in poverty, working low-paying jobs such as maid, hucksters, a person who sells small items, spinsters, and prostitutes. The city did not free women from patriarchal exploitation, yet it offered them significantly more autonomy than the rural manors controlled by the lords. Women could live alone, with their children, and some even formed autonomous collectives with other women. The urban centers also provided more work opportunities for women. While most were relegated to the vocations mentioned earlier, many women also worked as smiths, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, milliners, ale brewers, wood carters, and retailers. By the 14th century, some women were becoming school teachers, doctors, and surgeons. Some cities had public health care, and female doctors, especially those that specialized in obstetrics, were paid directly by the city government for their services. Here we see women performing jobs that a century later, and still today, would be considered male labor, and which they would later be excluded from. Sister Federici says, as urban women, quote, gained more autonomy, their presence in social life began to be recorded more frequently, in the sermons of priests who scolded their indiscipline, in the records of the tribunals where they went to denounce those who abused them, in the city ordinances regulating prostitution, among the thousands of non-combatants who followed the armies, and above all, in the new popular movements, especially that of the heretics.
Whenever there was too much suppression and exploitation of any gender and a class, what happens? Movements! And that's how it happened here too. Women's movements started, but many people called it witchcraft, heresy.
This is an episode in a series of videos analyzing the book Caliban and the Witch, Woman, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation by the philosopher Sylvia Federici. Like and subscribe for more witchcraft, for more knowledge. Special thanks to you, Srepet, for supporting the channel on Patreon.